I mean, you could. Check. Check. One.
Well, let me welcome everyone to the virtual planes. Very excited for today's discussion around securing space and addressing the cyber risk. Couldn't ask for a better group of speakers than we're privileged to have join us today. Before doing that, those of you, my name's Frank Salufo, and I direct the McCrary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure at Auburn University, War Eagle. For those of us who follow our work, you know this is not a new theme for us. But what is new is we've collaborated with wonderful partners at the Cyber Solarium Commission 2.0 or CSC 2.0, as well as the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We're also going to be releasing a paper, more on that soon and later. But at the outset, I did want to thank the amazing work by Sharon Kardash on my staff, Kelsey Shields on my staff, of course, my co-author, Mark Montgomery, who we'll be hearing from soon, and the amazing staff at FDD, led by the one and only Annie Fixler. So without further ado, I want to jump into the conversation. To kick us off, we're going to have Mike Rogers framing a number of the pressing issues facing our country right now. And as everyone, I think, viewing knows, Mike was not only a former congressman, but he was chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He is a true leader on national security issues. I think we first got to interact around the early Huawei discussions, and in the words of Mark Twain, whereas history may not repeat itself, it tends to rhyme. I think we have a lot of similar challenges we're grappling with today. Mike came to Congress as a former Army officer and an FBI agent, and really thrilled to have you join us today, Mike. And your voice, I think, is so important for our country to hear. So what I thought I'd do is, rather than jump right into the discussion, I'd love to have you frame the issues. Obviously, where the Communist Party of China is in some of these issues, and more broadly, why are we where we are, and what do we need to do to get to where we ought to be? So, pretty broad question there.
Well, thanks, Frank. Thanks for the great work that you're doing there at Auburn. It's incredible. I think there may be a Rogers wing in Auburn, mainly because my brother put all four of his children through Auburn University. I told him, you should at least have a wing named after you for that amazing feat. They all got great educations. They're all going out doing great things. Most of them are engineers of one sort or another. Space, let's talk about it for a minute. The first real wake-up call when I was part of that national security structure in Congress in the United States, roughly about 2007, when the Chinese Communist Party fired a missile and hit a satellite, happened to be theirs, to prove that they had this anti-satellite capability. And we all started saying, this is a bit of a game changer. Remember, prior to really those early 2000 years, the United States was dominant in space. No other really competitor, no near competitor prior to that. So we did what we wanted to do in space and built those architecture in space based on the fact that we were unthreatened and undeterred. And that allowed us some immense capability in our warfighting capabilities. Smart planes, smart ships, smart soldiers, smart bombs, all of that space-based. And so the Chinese Communist Party for several decades now has been saying, hey, we're going to compete with the United States militarily. We're going to create a blue water navy. We're going to do all of these things. And they looked at, okay, what are their strengths, the United States, and what are their weaknesses? And they came to a conclusion that space was both a strength and a weakness. So they invested a lot of money early on developing capabilities for anti-satellite technology, both ground-based missiles, lasers, and anti-satellites themselves. And I don't, again, not to stir up a vision that this is about, a Star Wars type fight in space. It's think of it more of a bulldozer pushing a satellite off its course, or sapping its fuel, or destroying its sensors in a small but effective way. Is what you're going to see in the near term. And China has stated in that near term, they'd like to control space between Earth and the moon. Lots of strategic reasons to have that happen. And so when we started looking at this, it was hard to get people's attention, even in the US government, about, hey, we have this big and growing problem. And I'm not talking about the folks who are doing the work every day who could see this happening. I'm talking about the investment that it was going to take in a couple of things in the United States. One, we needed to make an investment that also protects the very expensive things that we were, firing up on rockets into space. Really expensive operations. Are we doing enough to protect those assets in space? How do we protect those assets? How do we protect assets that are already up there that don't have new technology that allows them to do to protect themselves in a case of someone trying to get that satellite out of orbit in any way? Are we resilient enough? Can we fire up an architecture in low Earth orbit fast and quick so that if somebody wants to take out some of our capability in low Earth orbit, we would have the capability to very quickly create a new architecture, fire up a new satellite, get things to happen at almost real-time speed? Are we ready for that? Have we developed that? And now you have commercial space integrating with our military and security infrastructure in a way that I think is very positive, but it also has some challenges and some hurdles that we're going to have to get over, mainly because we've inherited this legacy system of space that said, hey, we're unchallenged and undeterred. This seems crazy to me that we may have to have bodyguard satellites, which some people are calling them, which may be a very real possibility, very soon, to make sure that we can maintain capabilities. And then you just go right down the list from that, Frank. The cybersecurity threat isn't necessarily just disruption, and certainly that's a concern. But what happens if the information that is coming down has been corrupted in some way? And so your positioning system has you in one place, and the folks who are making battlefield decisions or seaborne decisions are getting information that has that battle group or that ship or that submarine in a very different place, because they've been able to, through cyber attack, been able to disrupt the information flow and insert packets in there that lead to bad decisions on both the sea and land and other places. Real possibility, unfortunately. And so trusting information becomes now a huge issue. So disruption, we have plans. We understood the ability to lose assets and other things. Now, what do you do when it comes to distrusting the information you're getting because you had a successful cyber penetration of your network somewhere? And so you start thinking the next layer down. Okay, this goes. We know the Chinese and the Russians have designs on trying to take out a lot of our satellite capability early on in any kind of a conflict. Do we have the supply chain to sustain rapid deployment and resiliency of the architecture that we have deployed? That's a very hard question for the United States, and one I don't believe we have gotten right exactly yet. So if you take those issues just in that order, you can see where we're going to have to act faster. We're going to have to deploy faster. We're going to have robust cyber defense up front and during any conflict. And we're also going to have a supply chain that does not rely on a single other country if we believe that when that balloon goes up, or hopefully not, but if it went up, we'd have the ability to sustain our space advantage. All of those things are hard. I don't believe the government today is configured for a fast-paced, rapid interoperability between commercial and space. And there's a lot of reasons that legacy kind of keeps nipping us in the backside, if you will. And I don't believe that we have taken seriously enough what happens when we lose key pieces of our satellite architecture. How do we make up for that? So it's not just defending it, but what do you do if it goes out? And so those are the kinds of things I think hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about today. I'm not saying it's over and we haven't done things and the US government hasn't done things. They have. China moves at a very different pace. When they show up, the whole family's there, right? In the US, we don't quite do that, right? So when they show up, they have the diplomacy arm, the economic arm, the military arm, the intelligence arms, all shows up with them, hand in hand. They skip down the street together. Here in the United States, we have to have meetings across different sectors, and we have to have some kind of a group hug meeting to get to where we need to go for rapid deployment of anything. We have to change that. I'm not saying we should adopt the communist system. What I am saying is we should adopt an American innovation system that allows us to act quicker and faster, because the Chinese are moving out. They know that they have a slight advantage in the fact that they can rapidly deploy and innovate after some theft of intellectual property. Guess what? We need to be able to move equally as fast to counter that growing threat in space.
Thank you, Mike. Very sobering thoughts, as well as very. I mean, you covered the space, you covered the waterfront in an incredible way in a short amount of time, and I'm glad that you brought up. It's not when most. I think most Americans are not aware of just how dependent our way of life, obviously from a military standpoint, economically, from an assured positioning, navigation, timing. I don't want to sound geeky here, but clocks do run the world. If you can mess with that, you can be ahead of anyone. And we need to invest accordingly. Now, our report does touch on some of the streamlining process, which I think is, I'm glad you brought up, as well as sort of harnessing innovation in the commercial sector rather than treating them as the stepchild, having them as a genuine partner in all of this. And that's where I think we can leapfrog anyone when we put our heart to it and our minds to it. But I would be curious in terms of, I see behind you your chip war, the book, and when we look at semiconductors and we look at the dependence that the whole world has on Taiwan in terms of production, and obviously the potential implications of what's going on in the South, in the South Sea, and the like. What should we be doing more around supply chain? And then I'm going to ask you a very pointed question. If you're a commander in chief today, what are the 3 things you would like to see done immediately?
Well, in writ large or related to our topic? That's a very big
related
question.
To our topic. Related to our topic. Yeah.
I have 3 things and just about everything, as my wife would tell you. I would, and I'm an eternal optimist. She also says that may be a genetic defect in me, but I do believe we can do this if we unleash American innovation. The 3 most important things are we really. We've had some fits and starts on the way the government handles cyber risk across the entire U.S. government enterprise. And we just have not gotten it right yet. And I know there's been some small and important steps. We just have not gotten it right yet. I don't think we can wait too much longer to have a consolidated effort on things like cyber defense. And remember why this is important, because the private sector is playing an important role in space. The defense is, they can protect their networks. The Defense Department does a pretty good job of protecting their networks, not perfect. But imagine now you multiply your threat vector here by adding all of these suppliers and everybody in the chain that helps build a satellite. And now you're dependent on their cyber protection and resiliency to keep you safe, to avoid getting into your networks later on. That is a huge challenge. I don't believe we've gotten it right yet. We have to do that. Secondly, I would make sure very quickly that we create an architecture using our private sector and commercial enterprise to get these low Earth orbit architectures, so that it makes it very unappealing for the Chinese or the Russians to start taking out these low Earth satellites. They know you can get one, but you won't get it for long. And we need to build that kind of resiliency. And the last part of that is the supply chain piece, I would say early. We need to friendshore. And we need to build capability, not capacity necessarily, but capability in the United States. We have atrophied ourselves in a way that's very, very hurtful to the ongoing national security protection of the United States in many ways, chips being a part of that, a big part of that. And you think those microprocessors, how important it is. Again, there's certain types of microprocessors, even the ones that aren't very boutique and specialized. But those microprocessors we need to have the best and latest capacity and ability in the United States. Remember, if this goes up, it's going to disrupt commerce and transportation and all kinds of things. And we should always plan for the worst, hope for the best. And matter of fact, work for the best, not hope for the best. And so in that process, we need to make sure that we have that capacity. And again, we don't have a cyber workforce that's going to meet the demand today. And I argue we need to change that as a part of this. So it's a very complicated, layered effort that we have to go through. And I believe we can do all at once. The U.S. government has done amazing things when we have a threat on the horizon. I can't think of a bigger strategic threat to the economic and national security prosperity of the United States than what China faces to us today. And they're telling us that. We probably ought to listen to them.
Mike, thank you for your sobering comments. Keep working for the best, as you said. Keep fighting the good fight. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Auburn is represented by the great Mike Rogers of Alabama as well. And on my board is Admiral Mike Rogers. So we've got a lot of Rogerses.
You can't have enough Mike Rogers, Frank. You can't have enough Mike Rogers in national security, I think.
Well, our next event is going to be Mike Rogers cubed. So it's going to be the three of you talking, since all three are incredibly informed. So thank you, Mike, and keep fighting the good fight. We're going to go into a little more depth of discussion, unpacking some of Mike's excellent preview here. And we'll start with Sue Gordon, who I will very quickly introduce. Sue, as I think everyone knows, is the consummate intelligence officer. She's led, she's been in leadership positions at the National Geospace Intelligence Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, and also served in the highest civilian intelligence officer role as Principal Deputy National Intelligence Director. So it's almost like NPPD at what is now CISA. But Sue, I mean, I've had the privilege of learning from Sue for a number of years, and quite honestly, the country is better off with the role that you played here. So I'd like for you to unpack a little bit of what Mike discussed here, and maybe specifically sort of hone in on how does this all evolve, and what are some of the wild cards? I know you've done some amazing work at InQtel, where you looked at different ways that the intelligence community can work with the private sector to drive solutions. And rather than me leading the witness, Sue, why don't you jump on in?
Well, one, thanks, Frank, for having me. Clearly, I need to pay you more so I don't have to follow Chairman Rogers next time. Let's see if I can give a little context. I love that Mike talked about advantage. It actually is my favorite way to think about national security, because it forces you into a temporal context. And if you take this concept of advantage and play it through the history of space, that neatly enough is my personal history, so I've seen it all. You kind of go early on, you have the United States and Russia, nation states, using space for national security advantage. The United States was super dominant in the capabilities that we were able to put in space that gave us ability not only to see beyond the horizon, but to project power for the purpose of deterrence, but also enablement of mission activities. It was one or two of us for almost the whole of the history we're talking about, until really in the late 90s, when you start seeing China, Japan, others coming on the scene, but they were not big actors. So it was two countries playing out the game of advantage, and I think it was disproportionately on the American side. Simultaneously, you see the bleed through of technology, and you see the rise of commercial space. And you start with Landsat, and you go through what we have now, and now you start thinking about societal advantage and space as an infrastructure that allows human activity in really interesting ways to see the Earth from Earth observation to communication at speed, to communication at reach, to now being able to use it for change detection in really interesting ways. So nation state actors, few to many, commercial, narrow mission to now dominant mission. And if you look at just Ukraine, you can now see that the benefit and the advantage of commercial and national systems are very clear. The effect of that is that anything that provides advantage becomes of interest to adversaries and competitors, right? So the threat surface is now not just national systems, but the aggregate of systems. And it was proven in front of the whole world over the last year. So what does that mean? That means now that the threat surface extends to the private sector. We need to find a way to ensure that that will be protected, but you protect that differently. And neatly enough, you can't insert the government so strongly that you slow down what our industry does, because in fact, that engine is part of advantage. Being technological leaders is part of advantage. So I think what's interesting about this moment is it's a very busy space. Its benefit has been recognized. Technology advantage has been really diminished. Everyone has access to roughly the same technology. The control of it extends beyond governmental control. And so the security of it, which is disproportionately important to free and open societies, has to be shared between the private sector and the US. And so how do we get awareness and investment in security without retarding the innovation engine that has served us so well and well over the course of time? So I think it's just a really interesting moment to think about how you do that effectively. And we could talk about the intersection of space and cyber. They're very similar arcs of advantageous and adversarial use of that space. But I just think in understanding this moment of what's playing out is actually the key to understanding all the pieces that we need to address.
Thank you, Sue. And going back to one of your old leadership roles, do we need a Bill Donovan for where we are in this? So I think you in many ways brought that, and Donovan was able to work with industry in a less bureaucratic kind of way. And maybe we'll table that, but I want you to jump into that because I kind of feel like we do need that equivalent for this domain. But do you want to jump on that quickly?
I'll be brief, and then we'll come back to it. This is a leadership moment. This is a time in aggregate of strategic uncertainty, right? Where just growth without constraint is not going to do it. You have to have a vision of the outcome you want to have happen. But here's the rub. This is not a moment of simplistic outcome. This is not a moment where the outcome is holding and protecting what we have, because that won't ensure that we have something worth protecting. So you do need, this is a leadership moment. You do need national security leaders to think about how they pursue the mission they've always had in this environment that is so integrated, so connected, so data abundant, so technologically ubiquitous. How do you do that? And the answer is you do it by partnership, by the government doing what the government does well, allowing the private sector to do what the private sector does well, and recognize that the citizen is the one that is actually the player in this across the way. So we can go into it later, but yeah, it's a moment of leadership.
Well said. And for those who don't know, Bill Donovan was the founder of OSS, which ultimately became the Central Intelligence Agency. But I think you teed it up perfectly for General Quast. General Quast, for those who don't know, is CEO of SkyCorp Incorporated. Amazing service inside U.S. Air Force, rising all the way up the ranks. Started as a pilot in Desert Storm, so has a lot of scar tissue as well as leadership roles inside the Air Force. And what I found a little amazing is he grew up raised in a remote African tribe, so not exactly the experience everyone has had, but I think it has definitely influenced the way he leads. So, General Quast, I want to start. So, Sue was talking about the private sector, and I thought maybe we can talk a little bit about the space economy, where it is now, and how you see it expanding in the future.
Well, thank you. And I think we've spent some good time understanding the nature of the problem. What I would kind of state as the beginning of this is that we have historical examples where we have done the same thing, because space is not new with regard to the fact that it's interesting. It hasn't ever been done before the way we need to do it. And it's important to realize that, as I went from the national security role in uniform to the commercial private sector as a CEO, it's based on this understanding that all national security is economic, and that the government's role is to protect the industrial base to be stronger, more affordable, more agile, and faster than the competition, no matter where that competition comes from. And sometimes it'll come from one state, sometimes it'll come from another. So ultimately, this is about stoking the fires, as Sue and Mike both said, of the industrial base, the commercial sector, the private sector, and allow the government to put its thumb on the scale in just enough way to help. And the two examples I'll cite is when we were deciding whether we should have a Navy or not. And our founding fathers wrote in the Federalist Papers for years arguing that point. We decided that we needed one because of the commerce of the open oceans and the need to be able to protect our economy. When airplanes were invented, the open skies economy of transportation and logistics transformed the world. And what did the government do in both of those situations? They stoked the shipbuilding industry and the fueling stations in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and the navigation and all the technologies that are in the layered approach to dominating the open oceans for the commerce and the benefit of all countries, to include America, because it lifted all boats, no pun intended. When the airplane was invented, look at what the American Congress did to stoke the aviation and the aircraft building industry. So many examples, the Boeing 707, all of these examples. And both of those were just like space, where there are multiple technologies that were groundbreaking. So in space, we have, things such as artificial intelligence, and we have things like quantum, and we have things like laser communications, and all of these nuanced technologies. The journey ahead can be simplified by the government partnering, as has been said, with private companies and industry to stoke the industrial base. And our young engineers and scientists will just knock the ball out of the park with all of these inventions that bypass the architecture we have. Because the architecture we have right now was never built or designed to be fast, to be affordable, or to be resilient. I mean, think about that. It was never designed to be fast, to be resilient, and to be affordable. It's just like the internet was never designed to be secure. It was designed to be open so everybody could benefit. And then evil people started using it for bad things. The same is true with space. We can't try to double down on the current architecture and make something secure, fast, and affordable that was never designed to be secure, fast, and affordable. We need to let the industrial base bring us those clever solutions that only business people will think of. Only these young engineers and coders, hardware, software, logisticians, rocket scientists, they're the ones that can bring the capabilities faster, cheaper, and more resilient to the government, to include rapid access to space. So you can have a fulfillment center somewhere where if you need a new satellite to develop a capability, it's in orbit within an hour and not months or years, which is the current battle rhythm or pace of space. So I'll stop there, but the economic foundation is key, because without a strong economy, no competition can be successful with any other country. Because wars, the American way of thinking about war is this decisive battle. and we win and we go back home. That is not consistent with human nature. It is not consistent with history. Struggles between values of different worldviews, different cultures, is a long slugfest of economic power. And if you can't do it cheaper and for longer than your competition, you will eventually lose, because humans are stubborn. And China is not going to change their mindset. And America should not change its mindset, where we value every human being, no matter where they were born, what they believe, as long as they respect other human beings. This is the game changer in the history of mankind that starts with our Constitution. And that's what space is fighting for. Space is the saving grace for American culture, and it grows the economic pie. As we watch a global slowdown with 8 billion people, this grows the pie so that industrial base in space can bring unlimited information, unlimited energy, and unlimited resources to people on Earth and people in space working. That's the promise that we're talking about, and it's that simple. Don't overreach, government. Put your thumb on the scale like you did with the Panama Canal, with shipbuilding industry, with the aviation industry. That is the key.
Hey, General, you dropped a whole lot of knowledge there, and one question and how you ended. I do want to pick up that discussion with others as well. Technology changes, human nature remains consistent, and the reality is when we look at these issues, it's dangerous to look at them so narrowly that we don't appreciate the bigger struggle. And that's honestly democratic regimes versus autocratic regimes. And I really do hope we can pick up on that discussion. But when you started, an Air Force officer was espousing the greatness of Navy, which is and shipping, which is a perfect segue to our next speaker, Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, retired. Mark and I have known each other way too long. Worked in cyber before it was cool, and he not only directs CSC 2.0, he also directs the CTI at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and bottom line was did yeoman's work as executive director for the Cyber Solarium Commission. Mark, you've got the tough job here, and you know I have some opinions on all this, but to unpack our paper a little bit, and I thought we'd start specifically sort of getting a sense of what are the three big things that the executive branch should do to get us closer to goal here.
Hey, well, thanks, Frank. It's great to be with you and my friends Sue and Steve Quast. Now, I will say, Killer Quast, I've never heard. I always rely on him for a strong spousal of why we're at heart a maritime nation. But look, on our report, I think the first thing I ought to say is the key finding that Sharon, you, and I had, which is that we needed to strengthen the space systems, name it a U.S. national critical infrastructure, and in doing so, we would close the current gaps, both and signal both at home and abroad that the United States is committed to the resilience and security of space systems. We also went and defined what space systems were. We looked at the whole ecosystem from ground to orbit, sensors and signals, data and payloads, and the critical technologies, economic opportunity, and supply chains in space. So it's a big issue. And to unpack that, the key point was that it needed to be designated a national critical infrastructure. And that, to give the background on those are infrastructures detailed in Presidential Policy Directive 21, which is a 10-year-old Obama administration directive that really should have been updated, 3 years ago, 7 years ago, and 5 years ago, and 7 years ago. It was meant to be, consistently updated. 3 administrations in a row really failed to do that at this point. But there is a way to designate critical sectors on the fly. The Secretary of Homeland Security can do that. And in fact, we designated a subsector in 2017, the election subsector, underneath the government sector. So we need to designate that. And the reason we do is because it meets those three there's 3 things that can make you a critical infrastructure: national security, economic, involvement in economic productivity or involvement in public health and safety. And in space is all three. We clearly need that. So the first and foremost thing I would say is we need to designate we need to designate space systems a national critical infrastructure sector. And I don't think we should wait for the rewrite of PPD 21 that the Biden administration is promising, because they're good people working hard, but they say things like, "We'll have a new PPD 21 in September." My answer to that is, which September? I don't think it'll be this September. We can do this now. The Secretary of Homeland Security can send to the president through the National Security Advisor and the Homeland Security Advisor a request to designate it. And I think that should be happening now. So the very first thing we have to do is that, and tied to that is, which federal agency is going to be the lead for supporting it, because that is a key element of PPD 21. There were a lot of ideas in here, and for sure, no one agreed on any one. There was not a consensus. But we looked at it hard, and I think the area where we landed was the right one, which is that you need a sector risk management agency for the overall sector that's NASA. I think they're uniquely positioned, have the relationships. They really get at that economic, they get at at all the different elements, national security, economic productivity, public health and safety of this issue. And, but I do recognize that, like many other sectors, transport, energy, we need subsectors, and there needs to be a Department of Defense a sector for defense and intelligence issues, probably managed by the Department of Defense, as they do the Defense Industrial Base. That subsector, and then I think you need a subsector for communications, because the FCC's already got a very strong relationship in there. So I think with that, you could do it. If I could say one other thing the government has to do, they've got to set up the supporting ligature around that, and that's the GCC, the Government Coordinating Councils, and the Sector Coordinating Councils. And these sound boring and bureaucratic, and they are, but they're critical. The sectors that are run well, and I point to the Department of the energy sector, have great SECs and GCCs where the participants are the CEOs of companies. Tom Fanning, for years was the chairman of the electrical SEC, deeply involved with the government, and brought, a commitment from his company and got the commitments of the other CEOs that were there alongside him. And so in my mind, setting up, naming it a sector risk a national critical infrastructure, putting NASA in charge of the sector with two carved out clear subsectors for defense and intelligence and communications, and then really getting the GCC, which is the government coordination, right, with the SCC, the sector coordination. If we can do that, we're going to really put ourselves in a good spot. And we don't have time. This isn't like in the next administration we'll get. No, this is a this year thing, so that we can get moving.
Hey, Mark, just to underscore, this is not an academic exercise. This actually has real implications in terms of designation and prioritization, not only signaling to industry, which I think has to be integral to the way forward, but also to our allies and to our adversaries. We're putting a few markers in the sand with this. Yes.
No, exactly that. To me, it's the achievement. It's what you get out of creating a critical infrastructure, and it's the signaling to industry that we're serious here. Industry's asking for this sort. They're not asking for NASA or DoD or FCC. They're asking for engagement, and they're asking for the government to be more involved in these. And I'll tell you, I love the Space Council. I'm glad we create the National Space Council. I'm glad we created it. But I worked at the NSC for 3 years. You worked there in the White House. You know that you can coordinate things from the White House. You can't do the blocking and tackling of leading. That's done by agencies. That's done by the DNI or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State or the Homeland Security Director. That is who gets things done. The White House is, in theory, an agile, streamlined organization to coordinate. I had to choke a little bit of that down as I said it, but it's an agile, streamlined organization to get the president's intent transmitted to those federal agencies. And the Space Council sitting at the White House like that can communicate that. It can't lead it. The leading's got to come from your sector risk management agency, and as I said, the GCCs, SCCs. And look, and NASA, they can do this. There's some things we're going to have to do. We'll talk about that, but to me, that is the critical role.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to pull Sue and Steve in on this discussion, and then I want to pull the thread on Steve's points versus autocratic, democratic, because I know that that's something Mike Rogers has been very eloquent on. But before we go to that set of questions, when I came into this study, I immediately thought of the Title 10 and Title 50 equities, and I thought this had to be DOD. And the reality is we got great input from some of the top subject matter experts, and I want to thank them in terms of the folks we interviewed across the board on some of these issues. But where I ended up was, yes, the Title 10, Title 50 national security mission is critical. The Department of Defense still must and should play a key role in all that, but space is much broader than simply those equities. I mean, Sue, Steve, we'll start with you, Sue. I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that, because I ended up in a very different place. I normally know what I want to write before we jump into something, but in this case, I pivoted. So I'd be curious. We all pivoted, and when I say that, all of our authors. So, Sue, Steve, what would you think on this?
So I'll jump first, and then Steve, you fix it and make it better. Let's see. In 2023, national security includes economic security, right? It includes the systems we're producing, the commercial systems, how you protect, how you assure, how you create advantage is not the same as it was in 1947 or 1963 or 1996 or any of those years. How you assure national security now must go through economic security, must involve participation with the commercial sector, cannot be controlled in the way you control purely governmental assets. And so I think you're right that we have benefited from defense and intel leadership over all these years, but they have a particular view of how you maintain advantage. We need to include what commerce is doing, what transportation is doing, what NASA is doing, how we protect the companies and the advantage. So I think you're right that it cannot be just left to the department or the national security community as narrowly defined in order to ensure that we have advantage in this space. So I think your instinct to try and come up with a way to do that is good. I think you've done that by this consortia approach, which everyone will worry about because that isn't the strong suit of the government. What I would hope is that this consortium recognizes the imperative and then does a little bit what the SEC did back in the 30s, which says we're going to set the imperatives and the standards, but we are going to allow the private sector to input how we achieve that. And so you'll get this benefit of the government setting the framework and the standard and the private sector saying, okay, here's how we can meet that. So I think you're on the right track, but it's going to have to go beyond just a governmental solution. It's going to have to include them.
Well said, and yes, we've been long on nouns, short on verbs on a lot of these issues, and if we don't pull the private sector in, not only a seat at the table, but a front row seat at the table, hand in glove, I don't think we get that far. General, I'd be curious what your thoughts are on all this.
Yeah, for me, this really starts with a recognition by the executive branch and the legislative branch that we are in an economic competition with other great powers that want their values to be the dominant predicate for the economic global enterprise. And so it's not yet. We all of us on this panel have lived through leading change. This disruptive reality that new things threaten old models of business and governance, regulatory, statutory. And so things need to change, and nobody likes change. So for me, the three things we all need to focus on if we want to do this is one, the recognition that we've got a competition on our hands that could threaten our ability to protect our society, our economy, and our government. And the second is the leadership. When you look at historical examples where we had to insert capability that was going to be disruptive to a certain component of our government or our economy, you needed to pick leaders that know how to lead change in large bureaucracies. You need to have the money protected by the top level of the executive and legislative branches, so it doesn't get swiped away by an appropriations act at the last minute. And you need the person to be protected, the leader to be protected. When we were trying to usher in the triad to combat the fact that Russia had built a nuclear bomb and was building rockets to launch those in intercontinental ballistic missiles. General Schriever was put in charge of building those rockets for America, and the first 13 rockets blew up. And the only reason that money didn't get stolen from him after the second rocket blew up was because he played golf with President Eisenhower. Okay, now we don't need to play golf with the president, but we need that recognition. And Congress, he had allies in Congress. Without Congress and the White House on board, without the right leader of courage that knows their way around the bureaucratic knife fights in the back alleys, in committees and in meetings that take place, and without a personal protective ideology where they pick the right leader and they protect that leader to achieve success, without those three components, no matter where you put this, no matter how you divide it up, it will fail. So we need to move fast, and the only way to move fast is the right leader, the right money protected, and the individual leader protected by the executive and legislative branches.
Thank you, Steve. And Mike, I want to bring you in because I think you have a hard stop soon. But Steve brought up the cultural sets of issues, and I always grew up thinking the American way, the democratic process is the only way, and I still believe it is. You stood up an organization called LEAD, which is very much behind that philosophy, which is to leadership to ensure the American dream. And when you really get down to it, the secret sauce, the ingredients that make the American dream so unique is not just the traditional hard edge of power, but all the other innovative components that let us lead. Is this hyperbole? Am I over hyperventilating here, or are we at a point where technology is a double-edged sword, and we can't take for granted that our democratic norms will drive the way forward? I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are on that, and then bring in the panel, and then go a little further into the. Mike, before we lose you, I wanted to make sure we give you an opportunity to share some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. I don't think we have 2 or 4 years to dawdle on this problem set. We have never really faced a strategic competitor like China. So think of the Soviet Union only with money. And what China was very successful at doing, where the Soviet Union was not, is the Soviet Union was a little bit more brute force, and they used their brute force element to lock people up and send them to the back of their houses and tell them not to come out until they were told to do so. The Chinese Communist Party is doing something very different. They're using the economic power that they have in an extortionate way to isolate resources and natural resources around the world for their own successful economic future, in a way that the United States doesn't have a consistent policy between national security, economic security, and energy security, which we didn't mention today, is equally as important as all of those elements. And we haven't lashed all that together to say, okay, if we're going to compete and we're going to win, which we can, we are going to have to start lashing things together across the government. one of the things the Admiral Mark was talking about kind of sent a chill down my spine about, hey, we're better at this if we have a coordinating body and then a GCC body that coordinates with another GCC body that comes up with. I don't think we have time for any of that. I would have one person in charge of making this happen. And what you'd have to do is try to eliminate much of the red, I call them red cards, right? Everybody gets a red card. Very few people get a green card. We need more green card holders in the government to make sure that we're advancing at the pace we have to. And that means coordinating resources. Yep, that means you're going to take something out of somebody's sandbox. There's going to be screaming that you'll hear in California from Washington, D.C. But if we don't do this and we don't do it soon, we will not be able to keep pace with China's investment in the next generation of technology. And I tell people, for listeners here, if you're thinking, I don't quite get it, we're good with technology, they're good with technology, but you've talked about this, Frank, about this clash of values. So China wants to be data dominant by 2025. And what are they doing with the data that they're extracting from their citizens involuntarily? They created a social credit system. That social credit system, you get a score as a Chinese citizen by the Communist Party. If you don't do well enough in that social credit score, they can deny you access to bus tickets, train tickets, airplane tickets, the right to travel anywhere else in their own country. And there are some millions of Chinese who have fallen victim to this. Maybe it's a tweet that says President Xi isn't always cracked up to be. Whoops, that's a negative score. And if you think about what the Chinese are trying to do in data dominance, it's not just in China. It's going to be internationally. You want to do business, and they're the the largest supplier of fill in the blank. Guess what? You don't hit their social credit score. You, as an American business person, you're not going to get an opportunity to compete in that space. That's how serious this is on that level. That is a clash of values between the United States and China. And it's happening now. This isn't 10 years from now. They're already doing this. They're making those investments to beat us in space, to beat us. Their Navy just surpassed the number of ships of the United States Navy. As they say in the military, quantity has a quality all of its own. And the fact that they're using their economics to take, France is a great example. They're using their economic power of government that they lash up with their military and intelligence part of their government, pushing France around. And that's all about contracts in the future. And what Macron fell trapped to was this notion that China was basically saying there's good things that can happen to French technology companies in China or bad things that can happen to French technology in China. And he stumbled around on the national stage wondering if the United States was the right bet. We should take away this notion that you should bet against the United States any day of the week, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months of the year. It will always be a bad bet to the United States. But what does that mean to us? We have to get our act together. We have to stop spending so much money we can't afford. The interest on our national debt will be bigger than the Department of Defense very soon. The fact that China is having eighth graders learn quantum mechanics. Last year, think of this, 69% of eighth graders across the United States could not read at the eighth grade level. We are in a crisis mode here across our value system in the United States. China knows who they are and are moving out. I suggest we have to do the same. And I would go through the government here. This is really important for all of us, I think. If you really ask the Admiral, do you want all these coordinating bodies and this group who has to do this group? If you have to have 5 meetings to get a decision, we lose. We need to streamline government, as you said, Frank, early on in this OSS model. Congress needs to say, here's what we need to happen. They can do that in conjunction with folks who are a lot smarter in the defense and intelligence business and have them guide that decision. Tell them that's what we need, give them the resources and say, come back in 6 months and 12 months and tell us how you're doing, how we're going to compete with China. This notion that we got to spread it around and have, the battle of the inboxes is really costing us in a way it's hard to visualize to the rest of the world. If you're in that system and you talk to these folks who are doing it, they're pulling their hair out. Let's let them, get back to stop pulling their hair out and start doing really creative, innovative things. And it happens in space and cyber in our Air Force. We need to have decision makers in a vertical. getting these things done. And then maybe, after we win this technological battle, if they want to go back to the battle of the inboxes, which is a very American trait, let them have at it. But until then, we have got to get our act together. We just don't have a lot of time on this.
Hey, Frank,
Mike, thank you for
I
your
made-
leadership here. Sue, I'm going to let you, Mark, because in fairness, I think what Mark was proposing is actually streamline. It's taking the spaghetti chart and streamlining the process. But one thing I just wanted to mention, and this is the highest, I wish we wrote this report, but the Australian Strategic Policy Institute did a study recently that looked at 44 key areas of technology. 37 of those, China is leading the United States. So that's the first empirically based study I have seen, and all in the areas we're discussing right now. So it's not leading in basket weaving, it's leading in key technology areas that we cannot afford to be left behind. But Mark, I'm going to let you jump into that quickly because I know that there's more there. And then Sue, I want to get your thoughts on this as well. So Mark, jump on in, please.
Real quick, I will say also on that study, the 7 we're leading in are 7 good ones. Don't short sell it, but it's embarrassing that we've really fallen down. So I may not have made it clear. Our goal is to put one agency in charge. And it happens to be NASA. What we are trying to do with the Sector Coordinating Council, I probably didn't explain right. That's actually the private sector. And what's different, and I think what's different than Schriever experienced back in the 1950s or Rickover experienced in the 1950s and 60s, where you could have the government lead it, was the government owned all the tools of research and development. Nowadays, I think the private sector is actually in a much better position to provide the guidance to provide advice and counsel. So the one thing where I would say, before I had a strong leader move out, the group he needs to talk to or she needs to talk to is that Sector Coordinating Council. And that's where, and we've seen that, like I said, in energy with someone like Tom Fanning, because what happens after he provides his advice is he then helps implement it within the industry. And even when it's not exactly what he might have wanted or the sector might have wanted, do a pretty good job of that. And I just think that is the one area where the government probably during the Cold War didn't need to consult as much with industry. But in the competition we're in with China, some of our frontline fighters, soldiers, so to speak, are in the private sector. So I think that's where we got to get it. And right now, they don't have a place without us putting NASA in charge and saying you're it. We don't have the government does a pretty good job, and I agree with this, of setting up, 50 different places to go to. And after a while, you just have a completely diluted leadership process. And so that's our goal is one, throat to choke, as Senator King, our Solarium Commission leader used to say, and then strong input from the private sector into that decision-making process.
I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because that is, I think, the differentiator is the private sector role in all of this. And this would be a CEO-led. So not to go back to World War II analogies, but one of my heroes was Vannevar Bush, who sort of brought industry, and it grew into the defense industrial base, but it initially started with ways that government could really lean on the best thinkers and minds and resources that the country had. And the truth is we need the same. But Sue, I know we've had some discussions around this. Anything you want to weigh in on here?
Yeah. Mike, I'm just like you. I always have 3 things. So I'll say 3 things on this topic. I think one of the areas where the government does need to get involved in ways that it hasn't and that we've been loath to do is I think we need to get involved in the standards bodies. We have been philosophically loath to do that because we so wanted the industry to drive what those are. But as we're moving into an area where you have more platform technologies than absolute technologies, our adversaries and competitors are controlling those standards bodies, and as you set the standards, you do some. So I think standard setting is in international bodies is something the government might need to look at. The second thing is I think we need to look at our whole ecosystem that is involved in technological superiority. So that's everything from investment in research to students in schools, to foundational education, to the labs, to the company, just to make sure that it is all tuned and not fighting against each other with different rules and different imperatives. And you see this when it comes to students and what are we doing with immigration. You can't exclude foreign students from the United States because that would be antithetical to the advantage that we have had historically. We want to attract the best talent. You can't then simultaneously drive them out of the country as soon as that they have a degree. So we need to tune the ecosystem for technological advantage. And then I think the third thing that I'll end on is you heard me mention that this is a time where every technology is available to everyone. What that means is that the person that can put it to clever use fastest is the one that wins. And one of the things that's going on right now is we don't have a technology problem. We have a use problem. We just aren't driving it into use as much as we need to. And whether that is the Defense Department figuring out a way to use this really incredibly emergent commercial space market, or whether that are some of these really new technologies getting deployed into the field to transform how we engage. I think focusing not just on the technologies, but getting them into use will be an important part of the advantage. And then I lied, I have a fourth. And I think we'll get to cyber at some point, but I will say that cyber attacks are really an assault on trust, right? And erosion of trust disproportionately hurts free and open societies. And so as you have space be the great enabler for the way society and security moves, making sure that that is protected against those who would erode our ability to trust it is an important part of this discussion we've been having about systems success, not just individual performance success.
Sue, thank you. And I'm really glad you brought up how application of technology. I mean, even in the warfighting domain, if you go back in history, it's the application and the use of technology that changed the game, not so much what was invented. It was how it was applied. And you can go all the way back to Attila, the Hun, and how he was able to use different means, technologies to achieve his objectives. So I'm really glad you brought that up because that often gets lost in the discussion. And I think that's part of the secret sauce. That's in the DNA of the United States, where we do better than the rest of the world because we're not trying to necessarily control the outcome. And I don't mean to be too blunt on that, but that is an area that I think if we harness right, we can reap big rewards. And it's when you look at space, it's very much like cyber. It is its own domain, whether it's warfighting or economic or you name it. It's its own domain, but it transcends all the others. In cyber, it transcends air, land, sea, space. And in space, it transcends air, land, sea, cyber. And Mark, I'd like to sort of get back a little bit to the paper, and I know we're running out of time here, but what are some of the congressional priorities that you think are worth sharing today?
Yeah, thanks. So, Congress has done a good job laying out what a sector risk management agency is. The Solarium Commission came up with some language and with some alterations, eventually became law. So once NASA or whomever is designated as leader, it'll tell them what to do. And here's Congress's number one goal, objective. They need to resource that, because the one way this will fail is if we tell any federal agency, except the Department of Defense, that is like guiding war bugs. If you tell any federal agency, hey, do this thing on the side, and we're not going to resource you, because what will happen is They will figure out how to do whatever you ask for the minimum amount of money, achieving the minimum, whatever you established, the minimum level of effort. So what Congress needs to do, I think, and the way we are, and I know McCrary is the same way. We put a number down when it's time, and so we said first year needs to be $15 million, but it really needs to build up to $30 to $45 million. That's how much it costs to manage a sector, because what you have to do is be out and present, working with the private sector, doing risk management, understanding, looking through the different supply chain issues that exist, and then investigating. This space systems has probably the highest upside of needed research and development of any critical infrastructure in the United States. You need money to do this. So Congress's first job is resource whomever's picked as a Sector Risk Management Agency. The other group, I got to give a big shout out to the private sector. They have created a legitimate space ISAC with a watch center without the government being focused on this. I mean, that tells you just how clear the need for for the government to get to step up and play its role is that the private sector, in the absence of the government, has gone and done many of the things that I wish other sectors had at this level. The space ISAC is more advanced than many other ISACs that have, in theory, government participation and help. The problem in space, of course, is that you're going to have to integrate this effort with what is a very a good effort by the U.S. Department of Defense to grow and develop and nurture both Space Force and Space Command. We're going to be integrally involved with this, and that to build that ligature over, and with at the speed that Sue, Steve, and Representative Rogers have said is necessary, means we have to get involved now. So, in my mind, the SRMA designation has to happen this calendar year, this fiscal year, and the budget being reviewed right now. There needs to be a plus up to whomever they designate as SRMA. And look, in the big picture of the federal budget, this is pockets, $15 million the first year, but you got to get it there.
Mark, thank you. I mean, all things said and done, it's marrying up authority with resources and leadership, and I think that's the case we want to make. Since so the tyranny of time requires I be a little bit of a tyrant, I'm going to let everyone sort of say their last parting shots. And Steve, since we haven't heard from you, you triggered the last discussion. Why don't we start with you and then go to Mark and end with Sue? And let me turn to you, Steve. So we didn't really, when we discussed the economy, I know that there's a whole lot going on there, and I know I'm asking for parting thoughts, but I know in our interview, you were really thoughtful in terms of exploiting minerals in space. It's not just the traditional industries we're looking at. We're going to build new industries that are going to be massive. So I'd like for you to touch on that, then say your closing shot, and then we'll go to Mark and Sue.
Okay, well, I'll be very brief, but most average citizens in any country in the world do not realize how the universe is filled with resources at our fingertips, literally a shorter journey than a ship going to Africa. And all of those resources are at our fingertips with current technology today. It is profound, whether it's mining that, turning it into 3D printing material that can be 3D printed in space or on Earth. I mean, space can benefit the human race with unlimited resources, unlimited information, and unlimited energy. That's the reality. That's what we're tapping into. So I'll leave it at that. But I want your listeners to leave this conversation with a tremendous lightning bolt of excitement and hope. And I'll use the fact that I grew up in a different world paradigm and a different culture. And I never really knew the American culture other than my parents, but I was off running around as my dad was a cultural anthropologist and missionary. My mom was medical, helping the kids and the women of the tribe. And when I came to America and I saw this free society and this Constitution, this is why I joined the national security arena. And I will tell you, having traveled the world and lived around the world and been a student of culture, history, human nature, and how technology changes history, everybody else in the world fears America. And if we want to get out of this, we build on our strength. And why they fear us is because we can innovate our way out of any problem. Economic, military, informational, you name it. We are the most innovative culture on the planet because we believe that the respect for every human being is in their brain and in their heart, not in their money or their status. And we don't pick winners and losers based on what we think. We base it on the performance of the idea. This is why we are going to do well. And I am in the private sector now and the commercial sector. And I'll tell you, the software engineers and the hardware engineers that work for us that are, young, and they understand and they believe in the human spirit, in the protection of people. They are agnostic of culture, but they believe in the values. And they will find a way around all these things. We need to be careful not to pick winners and losers in the government and let our youngsters free. And they will find a way. Business leaders will find a way. Government will not. So that's an important distinction between the roles of government and the private sector. And thank you for letting me encourage everybody that we are going to win this race. It's just a matter of time and urgency. And the urgency is now, like Mark said, we got to do it this year or we're going to be in trouble. Thanks.
Steve, thank you for a very optimistic ending to all this. I'd add a third. So brain, heart, and hands, because at the end of the day, it's that application piece that I think is so important. And I don't want to get on a soapbox and talk about how academia has to be more applied, but at the end of the day, it's those three criteria, just to give you the third. Thank you for that optimistic message. Mark, anything on the paper? And I'll, when we close, make sure to let people know where to access the paper. But any parting thoughts here?
We argued for leadership, authorities, and resources. We felt protected space system is going to require good public-private partnership, a real one, because of the role the private sector is already playing, and that the appropriate sector risk management agency is going to have a demanding task, but NASA can do this. And I would just go back to, you alluded to something like this. Having a policy without resources is rhetoric. So it's get a policy now, resource that agency now, and stand back and let them lead the public-private partnership.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Sue, last thoughts?
All threats and opportunities are going to go to and through space. That means it's worth advancing and assuring. And because it is now shared between public and private sectors, this is a great time for the government to do what it does really well, which is to set a mark far in the horizon, use its deep pockets, and to eliminate sand in the gears, and to let the private sector do what it does better than anything else, and we'll be on our way.
Sue, thank you. Mark, thank you. Steve, thank you. And I know we had to lose Mike Rogers earlier. I mean, there's so much to unpack here. Bottom line is, with this event, with the paper, they're all meant to tee up and elevate issues that if we don't take seriously, we're in deep kinche. If we do take seriously, we will get out in front of our adversaries and quite honestly, back to the cultural principles of what is all underneath that. Thank you for all those listening in. We had big numbers. Thank you for those tuning in on C-SPAN. And for those that are interested in the paper, it can be downloaded at the CSC 2.0 site, at FDD's website, as well as the McCrary Institute's website. So thank you. Onward and upward, and that's a wrap. Thank you all.